A woman is dragged naked through cobblestone streets, while her own children throw stones at her face. Her crime, a whispered rumor. No trial, no evidence, just an accusation that turned her neighbors into executioners. But that was just the beginning. What came next was so disturbing that even the priests performing the ritual vomited. This isn't fiction. This happened thousands of times across medieval Europe, and the methods they used were so psychologically devastating that modern torture experts still study them today. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you the real documents, the actual laws, and the horrifying testimonies that reveal a system of punishment so calculated, so theatrical, and so brutal that it makes modern horror films look tame. And here's what will really disturb you. The people who designed these punishments weren't sadistic monsters. They were respected community leaders, priests and lawmakers who believed they were doing God's work. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you'll understand why one historian called this the most systematic destruction of the female body in European history. And fair warning, some of what you're about to hear crosses lines you didn't know existed. Before we dive into the specific punishments, you need to understand something crucial. This wasn't chaos. This was a system, a carefully designed machine of terror that operated across centuries and continents, from the frost-covered villages of Norway to the sun-baked squares of Spain. In medieval Europe, a woman's body was never truly hers. The moment she married, she became what legal scholars called femic, covered woman, covered by her husband's identity, his property, and like any property, damage to a Tito was a crime against the owner, not against her. An adulteress wasn't just breaking a marriage vow. She was committing theft. She was counterfeiting heirs. She was destroying a man's most valuable asset, his certainty about his bloodline. Think about the economics of this for a second. In a world without DNA tests, without birth certificates, the only way a man could be sure his children were actually his was through the absolute sexual control of his wife. Her infidelity didn't just wound his pride, it threatened to redirect his entire fortune to another man's bloodline. It could destroy alliances between families. It could invalidate treaties between kingdoms. So, the response had to be proportional to the perceived threat. And that's where it gets dark, because these punishments weren't designed just to hurt one woman. They were designed to terrify thousands, to create such vivid, scarring spectacles that every woman in every village would carry the images in her mind like a brand. The cruelty was the point. The horror was the message. And here's the part that should disturb you most. The communities that carried out these punishments weren't filled with evil people. They were filled with ordinary people who had been conditioned to believe that this level of violence against women was not just acceptable but righteous, necessary, holy. Let's start with the punishment that was considered merciful. They called it the carting or the penance walk. But those gentle terms hide something far more sinister. This was psychological warfare disguised as justice, and the first weapon in this war was the shaving. Imagine you're a woman in a 14th century German town. Before dawn, the bailiff and his men break into your home. They don't arrest you quietly. They make sure your children watch as they drag you to the town square where a rough, wooden stool has been set up. A barber, sometimes the same man who shaved your husband for years, approaches with shears. But he's not here to give you a haircut. Historical records from Augsburg describe how they would deliberately make the shaving as ugly as possible. They'd leave patches, cut the scalp, make the woman look not just shaved but diseased, monstrous. One account from 1487 describes a woman who begged them to at least make it even, and the crowd laughed. Her humiliation was their entertainment. But the shaving served a deeper purpose. In medieval symbolism, a woman's hair was her crown, her beauty, her feminine identity. Joan of Arc was accused of heresy partly for cutting her hair. For a married woman, her bound or covered hair was a symbol of her modesty and her marital status. To shave it was to unmake her as a woman, to strip away not just her hair but her social identity. Then came the stripping. And this is where it gets especially calculated. In some regions, they'd leave her in a thin shift, basically a nightgown. In others, particularly in England and parts of France, the law explicitly required complete nudity. Why? Because female nudity in public wasn't just shameful. It was spiritually contaminating. It transformed her into a walking curse, something that polluted the very air around her. Now here's where the psychological torture really begins. She's not just paraded through any streets. She's marched past her own house, past the church where she was married, past the market where she bought food, past the homes of people she's known since childhood. And at each stop, the crowd grows. But here's the truly diabolical part. Participation wasn't optional. Town records from multiple cities show that citizens could be fined for refusing to witness these processions. Your neighbors, your friends, people you'd shared meals with, they were legally compelled to be there, and many went further than mere witnessing. Court documents describe how crowds would throw not just rotten vegetables, but stones, mud mixed with human waste, dead animals. A record from Tus in 1342 describes a woman who lost an eye when someone threw a sharp bone. Another account mentions a pregnant woman who miscarried. From the trauma, the authorities didn't intervene. This was working as intended. A procession could last hours. In larger cities, they'd take the longest possible route, sometimes parading the woman for 6 or 7 hours under the hot sun or in freezing rain. Some women collapsed. Some lost their minds right there in the street, screaming incoherently, which only added to the spectacle. And then came the final cruelty, the return home. She'd be released at her own doorstep, where she'd often find that her husband had already locked her out. Her children had been told not to speak to her. Sometimes her possessions would be piled in the street, already claimed by neighbors. But the punishment didn't end there. That's what makes this so psychologically devastating. A woman who underwent this ritual was marked for life. She couldn't remarry, couldn't get work, couldn't worship in the church without sitting in a special section reserved for public penitents. One chronicle from Paris describes a woman who 15 years after her penance walk was still recognized on the street and spat upon. This was social death by design, and it was considered the lenient option because when an accusation lacked proof, the system had something far worse in store. Trial by ordeal. Even the name sounds medieval and barbaric to us now. But here's what you need to understand. To the people of medieval Europe, this wasn't barbarism. This was the ultimate form of justice. They genuinely believed that God would intervene to save the innocent and condemn the guilty, which makes what actually happened even more horrifying. The most common ordeal for accused adulteresses was trial by cold water, and the theology behind it reveals a kind of twisted genius. The water used wasn't just any water. It was blessed by a priest, sometimes taken directly from the baptismal font. The reasoning went like this. Since water was used in baptism to wash away sin and welcome people into God's grace, it would naturally reject a sinner. Pure water would not accept impure flesh. So here's how it worked. Based on detailed records from dozens of trials across England, France, and Germany, the woman would be brought to a river, pond, or specially constructed pool, usually at dawn. The entire village would be required to attend. Again, compulsory witnessing. A priest would perform an elaborate ceremony, blessing the water, calling upon God to reveal his judgment. The woman would be stripped down to her shift. Then, and this is explicitly documented in legal codes like the Saxon Spiegel, she would be bound in a specific way. They'd tie her right thumb to her left big toe and her left thumb to her right big toe, curling her body into a position that made swimming impossible. Some regions added a rope around her waist. But here's the crucial detail. The rope wasn't for rescue. It was to retrieve the body afterward. She'd be thrown into the water or sometimes forced to jump herself while the crowd watched. Now here's the horrifying physics of it. A human body's buoyancy depends on many factors: lung capacity, body fat percentage, the temperature of the water. A terrified woman taking rapid shallow breaths might initially float. And if she floated guilty, rejected by God's holy water, she'd be pulled out and immediately executed, sometimes right there at the water's edge. But if she sank, innocent, accepted by the water. Of course, a bound woman sinking in water can't swim, can't breathe. The historical records show incredible variation in how long officials would wait before pulling someone out. Some accounts suggest minutes. Others suggest they'd say a full prayer first, potentially 5 minutes or more. Here's a specific case from 1194 in England. A woman named Edith was accused by her husband's brother. She was subjected to trial by water. The Chronicle says she sank like a stone and was pulled out nearly drowned. She was declared innocent. She was also brain damaged from oxygen deprivation and died 3 days later. The record notes that her husband was ordered to take her body for Christian burial as she had been proven innocent by God's judgment. Think about the psychological torture of this. You're accused of a crime you may or may not have committed. Your fate is being decided by whether you float or sink. Either outcome could kill you, and you're supposed to believe that God is watching, judging, and He'll save you if you're innocent. Imagine the spiritual crisis. If you sink and drown, did God abandon you? If you float and are executed, did God condemn you? But trial by cold water wasn't the only ordeal. In some regions, they used trial by hot iron. The accused would have to carry a piece of red-hot iron for a specific number of paces, usually 9. Her hands would be bandaged, and after 3 days, the bandages would be removed. If the burns were healing cleanly, she was innocent. If they showed signs of infection, which given medieval hygiene was almost inevitable, she was guilty. One record from the 12th century Bavaria describes a woman who begged to be allowed to confess rather than undergo the ordeal. She was told confession without trial would result in harsher punishment, mutilation instead of execution. She chose the iron. Her hands became so infected that they had to be amputated. She still died from sepsis a week later. The court declared her guilty based on the infection and denied her Christian burial. Here's the truly sick irony. These orals were eventually banned by the Catholic Church in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, not because they were cruel, but because the Church decided that making God perform miracles on command was theologically inappropriate. It was disrespectful to God. The suffering of the women wasn't the concern. The propriety of the ritual was, but even after the official ban, trial by ordeal continued in many regions for another century or more, sometimes rebranded as tests rather than religious rituals. The horror continued. The women drowned, and everyone told themselves that justice was being served. And yet, as terrible as these punishments were, they could still result in death by accident or misfortune. The next punishment we're going to discuss was designed to ensure something worse, that you'd survive but wish you hadn't. If you wanted to understand the medieval mind, you have to understand their obsession with permanent markers. In a world where people couldn't read, where documents were rare, where identity was visual, marking someone's body was the ultimate form of record-keeping. And for adulteresses, the marking was designed to be unmistakable. The laws are shockingly explicit. The laws of King Cruelty, which governed England and parts of Scandinavia in the early 11th century, state clearly an adulteress shall have her nose and ears cut off, not as an alternative to other punishment, as the standard punishment. The law doesn't say may, it says shall. Let's walk through what this actually meant. Based on court records and chronicle accounts, here's how these mutilations were typically performed. The woman would be brought to a public square. Sometimes she'd be tied to a post, sometimes held down by multiple men. A blacksmith or barber would perform the cutting. These were the people with the sharpest blades and steadiest hands. No anesthetic, no alcohol to dull the pain. In fact, some regions explicitly forbade giving the woman anything to bite on because her screams were part of the spectacle. The nose would typically be cut off first, not just the tip, but the entire nose cut back to the bone of the face. The amount of blood was tremendous. Women would choke on their own blood, which is why they'd often be held face down. The ears would be cut off next, either partially or completely, depending on local custom. Then the wounds would be cauterized with hot iron to stop the bleeding. The smell of burning flesh would fill the square. The woman's screams would echo off buildings, and the crowd would watch, forced to witness what awaited any woman who strayed. Here's a specific case from 1231 in a German town. A woman named Gertrude was accused by her husband of adultery with a traveling merchant. She denied it. He had no proof except his suspicion and the testimony of one neighbor who claimed to have seen them speaking alone. Under local law, this was enough for conviction. Gertrude's nose and ears were cut off. The chronicle mentions, almost as an aside, that she had 3 children under the age of 7 who watched the mutilation. It notes that her youngest daughter couldn't cease crying for many days after. Gertrude survived the immediate trauma, but here's what happened next. Her husband divorced her, which was automatically granted in cases of proven adultery. She had no way to support herself. Her face made her unemployable. No one would hire a mutilated woman. She couldn't beg effectively because her appearance scared people. Within 6 months, the same chronicle reports that she was found dead in a ditch outside town. The assumption was that she'd starved to death. No one was prosecuted. Her death was not legally anyone's responsibility. But the purpose of these mutilations went beyond punishing one woman. Every mutilated woman became a walking warning, a piece of living propaganda that said, "This is what happens to women who betray their husbands." And because the mutilation was so distinctive, a missing nose and ears, everyone who saw these women knew exactly what their crime had been. There was no hiding it, no starting over in a new town. The punishment followed them everywhere until death. Some regions had variation. In parts of Italy, they'd brand women with hot irons, usually on the forehead or cheek. The brand would often be the letter A for adulterer. In France, some courts ordered the cutting of hair followed by the slicing of tongues, particularly if the woman had protested her innocence too loudly. There's a medical reality here that makes this even more horrifying. Many women died from these mutilations, not immediately, but from infection in the days and weeks that followed. Medieval physicians had no concept of antiseptic technique. The wounds would become infected, fever would set in, and sepsis would kill them slowly and painfully. Legally, this wasn't considered execution. The woman had been justly punished, and her subsequent death was God's judgment. And here's perhaps the most disturbing detail I found in my research. There are account books from several towns that show payments made to the executioner or barber who performed these mutilations. They were paid per procedure. In one town in Flanders, the rate was itemized: 3 shillings for a nose, 2 shillings per ear. There was a price list for destroying women's faces. But mutilation, as permanent and devastating as it was still a punishment for common women, for noble women, for women whose families had power and influence. The medieval legal system had devised something arguably worse, a punishment that would destroy you slowly in darkness and silence over years or even decades. In 1314, one of the greatest scandals in French royal history exploded into public view. It's known as the Tour des affair. And what happened to the women involved reveals perhaps the most psychological, devastating punishment medieval Europe could devise: perpetual enclosure. Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy were married to the future kings of France. They were caught in an affair, or at least accused of one. The evidence is murky, even in historical records. Their male lovers were brutally executed, flayed alive, and dismembered in public. But for Margaret and Blanche, death would have been mercy. Instead, they were sentenced to imprisonment in separate fortress chambers. Here's what that actually meant. Based on architectural records and chronicles, Margaret was locked in the shadow-wired in a chamber specifically prepared for her imprisonment. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were thick stone. There was one narrow window, too high to reach and too narrow for a body to pass through. The door was sealed with an iron lock, and a small opening at the bottom allowed for food to be passed through once a day. She was allowed no visitors, no letters, no news from the outside world. The only human contact she had was with the silent guard who pushed a tray of food through the opening. She wasn't allowed books, because women of her status usually couldn't read. But even if she could, none were provided. No candles beyond what was needed to see her food. No materials to write with, nothing to mark the passage of time except the rhythm of food delivery and the change of light from that single window. Margaret died in her cell after 8 years. She was 30 years old. The Chronicle says simply that she died of natural causes. Modern historians suspect either suicide or the physical toll of prolonged isolation, malnutrition, untreated illness, or simply the body giving up under the weight of psychological torture. Blanche lasted longer. She endured 11 years of enclosure before being moved to a convent where she lived until her death, still in isolation. By the time she died, she'd spent more time in captivity than she'd spent in freedom as an adult. But the Tour de Nes women were royal, which meant their imprisonment was at least physically comfortable. They had beds, blankets, adequate food for noble and merchant-class women accused of adultery across Europe. The reality could be far worse. There's a practice documented across multiple regions called immurement, being walled up alive. This was rare, but it happened. A woman would be placed in a small cell, sometimes barely large enough to sit in, and then the entrance would be bricked up. leaving only a small opening for food and waste removal. She would live out her remaining days in this tomb, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. In 1357, a woman in Barcelona named Maria was convicted of adultery and sentenced to immune in a cell built into the city wall. The chronicle describes the cell as being so small she couldn't lie down fully. She lived in this space for 9 years before dying. The record notes that her screams could be heard for the first several months and then silenced. When they finally opened the cell to remove her body, they found she'd scratched messages into the stone walls with her fingernails worn down to bloody stumps. The messages were prayers mostly and curses. The psychological impact of this level of isolation is something modern research is only beginning to understand. Solitary confinement for more than 15 days is now considered torture by human rights organizations. These women endured months, years, sometimes decades. And here's the cruelest part. This was considered merciful. It was explicitly framed as giving the woman time to repent, to reconcile herself with God before death. Her suffering was reframed as spiritual purification. The priests would say she should be grateful for the opportunity to contemplate her sins in solitude. Some women went mad. Chronicle entries describe women who stopped eating, who beat their heads against stone walls, who babbled incoherently when food was delivered. But there was no psychiatric care, no intervention. The madness was seen as either demonic possession, punishment from God, or the final stages of repentance before death. The silencing was also deliberate. These were women who'd been visible, who'd had social power, who'd moved in society. Their enclosure removed them not just from physical space, but from history itself. Many were not even allowed to be buried in church cemeteries when they died. Their names were struck from family records. They became non-persons, erased. And all of this, the mutilation, the drowning, the public humiliation, the living death, all of it was justified by the same system. A system that brings us to the final, most enraging truth about medieval justice. Now, let's talk about the men, because while women were being drowned, mutilated, and buried alive for adultery, what was happening to the men they allegedly committed adultery with? The answer will make your blood boil. In most cases, a fine, sometimes banishment for a period. In rare cases, public penance like wearing a sign or making a donation to the church. That's it. The double standard wasn't subtle. It was explicitly written into law. The Saxon Spiegel, one of the most influential medieval law codes, states that both men and women can be punished for adultery. But here's the catch. A man's adultery only counted if he was sleeping with another man's wife. If he was unmarried, or if the woman was unmarried, it wasn't legally adultery for him. It was just fornication, a minor sin requiring confession. But for women, any sexual contact outside marriage was adultery. Full stop. The crime wasn't about the act itself, it was about the property violation. Even in the rare cases where men were punished equally, there was always an out. Nobility could pay fines. Men could invoke their right to trial by combat where they'd fight their accuser, something women were forbidden from doing. Wealthy men could hire substitutes to fight for them. The entire system was designed with escape routes for men that women couldn't access. And here's the most gling part. The men who participated in the actual punishment process, the judges, the executioner, the priests who blessed the water for the drowning, the crowds who threw stones. Statistically, many of these men had committed adultery themselves. Research into court records shows numerous cases where men who sat in judgment on adulteresses were themselves later revealed to have kept mistresses, visited prostitutes, or fathered illegitimate children. The hypocrisy was the system, the cruelty was the point, and the message was clear. Women's bodies were not their own. Women's sexuality was a resource to be controlled, regulated, and punished when it strayed from male ownership. These weren't isolated incidents of medieval cruelty. They were systematic, legalized, and performed with the full support of religious and secular authorities across Europe for centuries. Thousands of women, maybe tens of thousands, experienced these horrors, and perhaps what's most disturbing is how recent this history actually is. Some of these practices continued in modified forms into the 18th century and beyond. Public shaming of women for sexual behavior never really went away. It just evolved. If this video disturbed you, good. That's the point, because understanding how societies have controlled, punished, and destroyed women throughout history isn't just about the past. It's about recognizing patterns that still echo today. The slut-shaming, the victim-blaming, the different standards for men's and women's sexuality. Drop a comment telling me which part of this history shocked you most. And if you want more deep dives into the darkest corners of history, subscribe now, because there are more uncomfortable truths we need to uncover.